Hi and welcome back. I apologise for being a bit late in getting this one up, but I have had such a great response to the "Would you like to do a Zoom?" And it's really taken an enormous amount of time just organising it all, trying to getting it all to work. But it looks as though it's going to be good. We've got some great, interesting people coming on board, and I hope we'll be able to have a really interesting discussion probably on Sunday. So as soon as I've finished all this, then I will get back to it and send out some login information and try and cope with New Zealand through Finland, UK, and to the west coast of America. There's a big time difference in that, so I'm afraid somebody's either got to stay up late or get up a bit early if they're going to catch it all, but we'll do our best. Okay, so where were we last week? Well, we had just, I told you all about the Rudd Concession, and I must confess my disgust of what had happened then was loud and clear. But, okay, that's gone, that's done. All sorts of unpleasant things were happening, there's no question of that. But what else was happening around that time? Well, one of the things that was happening was, of course, the Berlin Conference. Now, this was called because so many of European countries were fighting each other over Africa. And so the Kaiser knew he hadn't got nearly enough of Africa, so he called this in, and 14 European countries went. Not the Dutch, because they already had too much in South Africa anyway. But everybody else went, and on the face of it, it sounded right. So you couldn't go into anywhere without having a treaty with the chief. In return for what the chief could offer you, you had to make roads and infrastructure and provide good administration and health and education. That was the package. Sounds great. But it didn't stop Europe fighting each other, and it just meant that the whole thing intensified. So everybody was grabbing whatever they could that was left. Well, one of the very few pieces that was left, of course, was that land between two rivers, the land between the Limpopo and the Zambezi. And so everybody was coming in there, trying their hardest to get their slice of the action, which was why poor old King Lobengula was so absolutely bereft at trying to cope with this lot and asked the Rudd concessionaires to do it for him, which caused all the problems. Anyway, that's last week's. Eventually, the charter was granted. But Lord Knutsford, who was the colonial secretary, kind of put the cat among the pigeons a bit, because when King Lobengula asked Munch to take across two of his indunas to check that there was a great white queen, that wonderful story that I started with, this whole series with, and they did, and the ramifications of that and how the Matabele, when they got back, were absolutely intrigued to hear what these indunas had found out. With them went a letter from Lord Knutsford, which was from Queen Victoria to King Lobengula. And it said, "You, King, are very wise. Never give away more than a single ox. You don't give away your herd of cattle, otherwise what would there be left for anybody else to eat?" But then, of course, the chartered company started talking to them, and all of a sudden, Lord Knutsford, on behalf of Queen Victoria, wrote to King Lobengula again and says, "We feel that wherever gold is, the wisest and safest course for the king to adapt is to agree not with just one or two white men, but with one approved body of white men who will consult with Lobengula's wishes and sort out all the disputes between the white men." Well, perhaps, but my goodness, it was in complete contrast to what he'd said before. So I would have thought Lobengula might be just a touch concerned, wondering what on earth was going on. And while all this was happening, of course, the Portuguese had been trading up and down the Mozambique coast happily for a couple of centuries, I suppose, by then. And now they had to make things legitimate. So they had already moved up and made treaties with King Mutasa, Chief Mutasa and Chief Makoni. And both of those had treaties with the Portuguese, who were up there and taking minerals in exactly the same way as the Rudd Concession had asked from Lobengula. And that was happening as the pioneer column was being formed and was on its way up. But as you can imagine, the imperative to get that occupation going was absolutely enormous. So Makoni and Mutasa were vassals of King Ngungunyane, who was of that Gaza province. Now, the Gaza province at that time was much bigger. He claimed land which went right up to the Zambezi, to the Mfuli River, and to the Sanyati as well. Now, that's a big chunk which was claimed by King Ngungunyane of Gaza province. So Rhodes protested. A single person protested to the UK Prime Minister direct. This was the sort of thing Rhodes did. And surprise, surprise, the UK Prime Minister took notice. He brought back his minister from Lisbon and he put naval ships off Gibraltar, watching everything Portugal was doing. He ordered them to remove their soldiers from the Shiri, their miners from Kololo, and from Mashonaland, which the Portuguese did. They knew they were up against a pretty intolerant enemy, but they never forgot. They were furious, and they weren't going to let it go lightly. When that happened, of course, Makoni and Mutasa, oh no, we never signed anything with the Portuguese. No, of course you can, when your men come up with a pioneer column, we'll sign with them. Now, as well as that, to complicate everything, 5,000 Boers had almost arrived at the Limpopo as part of the Great Trek. They were just waiting to cross the Limpopo. Well, of course, it was the English who refused to allow them access. Lobengula would have been probably quite happy. He got on rather well with the Boers, but the British put a stop to that. So, there we had it. Jolly happy time over that wonderful land. Anyway, the main problem was, what exactly was Matabeleland? Because when Selous was approached and asked to lead this, he said, I will do it on one condition, and that is that we do not set foot in Matabeleland. But what was Matabeleland? Nobody really knew, because Lobengula had never claimed it. As had Mzilikazi or Lobengula before, they never claimed it because it was too easy. If they needed to do some raiding, get some more cattle, some more beautiful women, they just did it and then came back to Matabeleland. And because the Shonas were not good fighters, and they mostly then started building their houses up the koppies so that they could see the Matabele coming. So there was never a clear definition and line of what was Matabele territory. The British government, whether by intentional malice or not, we'll never really know, decided Mashonaland was not part of Lobengula's territory. And yet they'd originally made the seal that Lobengula used, which said Lobengula, King of Matabele lands and Mashonalands. Well, it was too easy saying it wasn't part, because then if it belonged to nobody except a few disparate tribes, it was up for grabs. But of course, when the Portuguese decided they'd like a chunk around the Mazoe area, the UK government changed its mind and said, oh no, this is Matabele territory. But of course, there were a few people who really didn't ever think that they'd ever make it. And you can just imagine some very titled gentlemen having realised that the charter had been given, saying, well, I think we'd probably better say nothing and just let them all go quietly over Niagara in their own way. Maybe a success, or it may not. We got the wrong waterfall, but never mind. The sentiment was there. So, right, there we are. Charter was granted. Britain didn't want to fund any more colonies, but she did not like the way Europe was tearing across and stealing all the areas she had already regarded as hers. So they were very happy when Rhodes said, yes, all right, I'll form a charter company and I'm prepared to put my own money in to make sure it works. So, also the only thing the British did agree with Rhodes was that those men already on the ground in Africa were far better able to administer it and to build it than people coming straight out from England. Absolutely. Don't know why that was ever the case, really, because at least when you'd been there, you had some idea of what you were talking about. So there we were. Dr. Jameson was a man whom Lobengula admired to the extent that he made him an induna of one of his crack regiments, the Mbezu. So Lobengula was an induna. Jameson was an induna and a friend of Lobengula. They seemed to get on very well. But it's quite interesting when you read about Dr. Jameson. He was obviously an absolutely outstanding medical man, but he seemed to have come across as a bit mercurial on occasions, and the Jameson raid, of course, was one such thing, but on a number of occasions it seems to have been just a little bit dubious. Now, with all of this happening, occupation was absolutely essential, so he spent months in Matabeleland with King Lobengula, trying to persuade him to give him the road for Mashonaland, assuring him, showing him maps, we're not going to touch Matabeleland, we just want the road to Mashonaland. Anecdotal evidence portrays Jameson as hectoring the king, until, sick and tired of it all, Lobengula just waved him away. And Jameson took that to mean that he had agreed, and immediately set about organising the pioneer column. So King Lobengula, having repudiated the Rudd Concession, then accepted it, then worked with the BSAC, acknowledging that this was the better way to go. He then did everything possible to make the entry of the pioneer column smooth and uneventful, and such was his strength and his command of his people that they literally had no trouble whatsoever, which is extraordinary. And it was delightful, actually, to be able to get from some people through these podcasts access to a lovely book which was written by Adrian Data, and he was part of the pioneer column, because I wanted that touchy-feely, what on earth was it like being part of that pioneer column? And this has given it to us, which is great. But having decided where they were going to go, etc., they then, of course, had to fund it. £350,000 was the estimate. Well, of course, they couldn't possibly cope with that. It was far too much. So Rhodes put it out to tender. And a young man called Frank Johnson, quite young, still in his early 20s, he said, I can do it for £87,500. Oh, okay. So there you were. So let's look at what the pioneer column was. Now, the Rudd Concession was signed at the end of 89. By late June 90, the whole full annexation of the pioneer column, the signing up of volunteers, was all completed 9 months later. Amazing. Right, what did it consist of? 180 volunteers. Now, these were all men on instructions from Rhodes, preferably who had an aristocratic background, and there were a lot of them around. The sons 1 and 2 could be catered for by the English family farms and houses, etc. But by the time you got to sons 3 and 4, they were always going to lose out. So it was to Africa, young man, go and make your fortune. Rhodes thought, let's get them on side, because hopefully their fathers will invest in my BSAC. And secondly, if anything happens to their sons, they're going to make a heck of a noise about it in Britain. So great. So most of them were of that ilk, but they were also young adventurers. And of course, imperialism was all that mattered. So 180 volunteers. Khama, of course, did not want the Matabeles on his border under any circumstances. So it was only after he was reassured by Britain that as a protectorate, they would always be looked after. And Khama then said, right, well then you can have 200 of my people to come and help you with clearing the way and lifting the trees and getting them out of the way so the wagons can progress, and 70 police who will look out for the Matabeles and help to keep you safe. The Mangwatas. So 270 came from Khama. There were 62 wagons, each of them loaded to about 2.75 tons weight, each of them drawn by 16 oxen. Massive. The whole thing was 2.5 miles long. Altogether, there would have been over 1,000 cattle just to cope with drawing all these wagons and to have spares for them. And then, of course, you had horses too, because all the volunteers and a lot of the other people were on horseback. And, of course, you had lung sickness and you had horse sickness, both of them requiring salted animals. Now, a salted animal meant with a horse, if it had had horse sickness and survived, that's fine, it wouldn't get it again. But there were again two varieties of it. Mostly if they had the one variety, then of course their price doubled anyway. That was a bit of a hazard. But with the cattle, they got this lung disease. And so what they would do is when a cow died, or an ox died, they would remove its liver, and taking a piece of that liver, they'd cut in an ox's tail, stick the bit of liver in, and bind up the tail. Gradually the tail would drop off, but then the ox was salted and they wouldn't get lung disease. Rudimentary, but it worked. So that was a major thing. You can imagine just trying to look after all of that. So Rhodes said, the man I want to lead it is Selous. So who was Selous? Just a quick recap. Frederick Courtenay Selous, the Alan Quatermain of King Solomon's Mines, was modelled on him. He was born in London on 31st of December 1851. A British Army officer, he was explorer, hunter, conservationist, famous for his exploits in southern and East Africa, one of 5 children from a very aristocratic family who were originally French Huguenots, and he had 3 African wives. So a very interesting man, Selous, and everybody trusted him completely. So they started calling for volunteers. And Adrian Data was one of those who decided to go along. He was only 21 at the time, and he writes well. I'll just read you some of these snippets. Frank Johnson, the man who organised the cost, reduced that cost, short, thick-set, 30 wide, dark, lungs of a bull, handles men well, but a hustler. Oh, we've got a real picture there. Then there were 3 people who worked with the chartered company. Johnson, Heaney, and Borrow. As far as he was concerned, Heaney did the thinking, Johnson did the talking, Borrow actually did the work. So another little interesting insight. Now, for somebody like him, who hadn't been in the military, constant drilling for the 3 to 4 months while everything was assembled. And they were turned into disciplined, fine soldiers who would respond at once and who took orders well, and they were taught to shoot, and they had to do manoeuvring and volley firing and independent firing at targets. They had to learn to retire fighting with a rearguard action, and when Lord Methuen came, later of Boer War fame, he said they could go anywhere and give a good account. So they were highly, highly trained over that period. Nothing was going to be left to chance. And what happened in a day in the life of that trek? Okay, well, as you know, in the army, you always count off 1, 2, 3, da, 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 da. So the odds and the evens would be labelled the right numbers and the left numbers. The right numbers would dismount, strip off all the accoutrements, rifles, hand axe, bandolier, tunic, haversack, water bottle, strap them to the front of the saddle by their wallet straps. Having done that, you handed over your horse to your left number, and they would look after them. Off you went with your shirt sleeves and riding breeches, booted and spurred and brown and brawny, to receive a large axe. And you'd move off to sit behind Selous, who would then point to the tree or the bush or whatever that had to be removed in order to create the road. Your left numbers would look after all the mounts, and they'd bring them up behind you while they were checking for wild animals. Lots of wild animals around, lion, leopard, all these things. And also looking out for the Matabele positions as well. So they managed the horses and they helped the bullocks. Coming behind them at oxen pace were the drivers, and they would catch up. 2.5 miles of wagons. Bullocks unyoking from one could cause a delay for the whole lot, which happened frequently. Scouts, the 70 scouts from Kama, they would check all the high points for Matabele lines just to see how they were and whether they were threatening. A bit scary for them because they were terrified of the Matabeles. So then we get to the midday halt. Off-saddling horses, feeding them, outspanning the oxen, grazing them. What an enormous effort to do all of that, to give them a break at lunchtime. Cooked their rations, ate their lunch, smoked and lounged until saddle up. Thank you, Adrian. Gives you a great picture. And then between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, the Selous would be looking for somewhere to lager for that night. And then, of course, they had to cut double the amount. They were not just cutting one road. They then had to cut double roads because the first wagon would go there, the second would go there, third, fourth. They'd come right round, meet at the end, and create the lager. So extra work to be done, alternating right and left. The front wheel of the incoming wagon would be brought to a standstill just past the hind wheel of the one in front. So there became your circle. Disselbooms and truck gear for the wagons were outside the lager, and they formed a barrier, together with all the tinned meat and the boer meal and the biscuits, should the Matabeles threaten. The cattle, having been well grazed, were then tied to the gear. Now that must have been very tempting for the Matabeles. Just imagine 1,000 cattle sitting there, and they weren't allowed to touch them. It must have been agony. Agony. The horses were picketed inside the lager, and the men slept under the wagons. So that was virtually a day's work. And the alternate troops that night would be chopping and axing or supplying guards and pickets and sentries to get them through the night. And he adds a lovely little comment here. It conclusively proves Great Britain's title to the land and upset the pretentious rights of the Chartered Company. So the Chartered Company was never very popular. There is no animosity to the CC. The good work of the company for the Empire is acknowledged, but the Empire must not forego her rights and place her pioneers in bondage to the company. Well, there you are, from a 21-year-old, strong words. And then he said, as for the king, he is an absolute despot, but completely honourable. So that's interesting. So there we have it. That was what was going on. That was how they slowly progressed 3 months later before they got to Harare. And what are the reactions as they went along? When the column first arrived, the Shona immediately denied any allegiance to the Matabeles. But of course, when the Matabeles attacked the pioneers, or attacked the white people, they promptly denied allegiance to the white people or the pioneer column. So that's fine. All right, you look after your own. Quite right. As everybody else did. The British from Lord this and Lord that all the way down. Lobengula ordered several regiments to shadow the pioneer column all the way, just to keep an eye on everyone who settled in Mashonaland. And these regiments stood in a long line at the edge of what they knew they could claim as Matabele territory. But otherwise, the king didn't appear to be too bothered about them. And he actually sent his 2 crack regiments up to finish off the Patoka lands across the Zambezi, just in case he needed to use those in the future. But how nerve-wracking must it have been for the pioneers, trying to forge their way through country with no paths, no roads, motorbit completely unsuitable for those heavily laden wagons, always under the steely gaze of hundreds of armed Matabele warriors. How agonizing must it have been for the Matabele to see that mass of foreigners calmly moving what they regarded as their territory. And in addition, they had to watch Mashona villagers haughtily going about their daily lives protected by the pioneers, and no doubt taking every opportunity to taunt the Matabele as they did so. I bet they did. All this taking place on land that the Matabele had raided frequently and regarded as theirs, but which they weren't allowed to touch. Now, how good a king must Lobengula have been? Because nobody ever spoilt it. So what happened to the pioneers eventually? Well, I think the country was fortunate to have well-educated, philanthropic people who were well off in their family, in their own rights, and therefore their interest was in the development of the country, and particularly of the people native to the country. A disproportionately high number ended up in African administration as district and native commissioners and did wonderful work in the future, as well as farmers, of course. They were always an outstanding bunch. And in my book, I've mentioned before my little character, Aidan, whom I just love. He's a great little man. He says the right things at the wrong time and vice versa. Now here he says, I almost hate to say it in your company, and it's really against everything I believe about the British. But as you've already asked my opinion, that pioneer column was made up of heroes. They must have been extraordinary men. And they must have been. Extraordinary men in an extraordinary situation. And it was going to have its hiccups, but the first 3 years immediately afterwards were surprisingly good and surprisingly consolidating for everyone. 3 months later, of course, the column assembled in what is now Harare. The flagstaff was the straightest tree that the naval men among them could find. The Union Jack was hoisted by Lieutenant Tyndall Biscoe, a 21-gun salute, prayer by Canon Balfour, the police chaplain, and the lands included were annexed immediately to the British Empire with 3 cheers for the Queen. That was the way it was done. So I take no sides, I'm just reporting it. And everything has its merit, everything has its bad points. What I just hope is that this series makes all of us consider everything else that was going around at the time. And to finish it off, one of the other lovely things that I was sent was the Plumtree Record. And this was a lovely little poem that was written by a mother and submitted. Nobody knows who she was. Build me a man who is strong and true, whose purpose is straight and clear. Build me a man who will make me laugh when my heart is gripped with fear. Build me a man who will hold his course, whatever the race he ran. Oh, for our country's greater good, Plumtree, build me a man. Imperialism again, but a time of great courage and extraordinary endeavour. I hope you've enjoyed it.